Hello, and welcome to live programming here at the More Freedom Foundation. Today, we're going to be discussing an interesting counterfactual proposition. What if, as a world, as the United States, as I believe, but as a world, what if we just hadn't destroyed Syria? We're going to be discussing that at length. It's a counterfactual history, sort of what would have happened over the past 10 years if we just hadn't destroyed Syria. For those of you who are new here, well, first off, allow me to apologize for being 25 minutes late. Despite having my entire job on the internet, I am extraordinarily technically incapable. Before each of these presentations, I restart my computer, and this time I was ambushed with a Windows update. If I'd had any sense, I would have made sure that the computer was completely updated in the morning or last night, and I apologize. And I'm extraordinarily grateful that many of you just waited with me for 20 minutes as we watched the percent updated tick up. We're here, we're live. I'm grateful. If you're new to this, you will see a live chat, I suppose, to the right of your screen or below the viewer. If you're on a phone, you are encouraged to jump in, say anything you want about me, my stupid beard, my stupid haircut. Actually, I think that's kind of a nice painting, but the stupid painting at my mom's house, whatever you want to do about me, go for it. We're also pretty broad-minded with what you can discuss in the chat. We're not, super politically correct about stuff. We do have one hard and fast rule, which is that you cannot attack each other. Nothing will get you blocked for all time from this more quickly than gravitating towards somebody on this chat and attacking them because of who they are, who they're from, what they believe, this, that, and the other thing. We have a very broad range of things we can discuss. We are not allowed to go after each other, attack each other, or disrupt the chat. Loga Cool Extreme. I don't know if on your view, if he's got the little wrench next to his name, he is the moderator. If you are acting out of line, it's completely in Loga's jurisdiction. He's been doing this for quite some time now. I trust him completely. If he tells you you're being out of line, listen to him. Because if you don't listen to him and continue your behavior, he will block you. There is no Court of Appeals for that. So keep it civil and let's talk about this, which I think is very interesting. As I've laid out in the description under this video, sort of under the viewing window you see here, I put out sort of my 3 best videos on Syria, and I am very much in the camp where I believe that it was the United States that destroyed Syria. It was the United States in alliance with Turkey and a number of Gulf states who poured in billions of dollars to turn what may have been a sort of grassroots, laudable, interesting sort of resistance movement for a month or two, very quickly turned it into a jihadist nightmare. And I think the country was destroyed. And I feel like I get in a ton of arguments about Syria that sort of devolve into, why are you defending Assad? Why are you defending Assad? And I agree, Assad is a very bad man. But I feel like a lot of our discussions of Syria just sort of devolve into fuck you, why do you support Assad? And then me being like, well, fuck you, why do you support, the CIA and the jihadists that did on 9/11 in destroying this country? But that's not a very productive way for conversations to go. So what I think would be more productive, and I think that one of my main critiques of a lot of people who just look at Syria and look at the bad things that Assad has done with no sort of historical knowledge or understanding of how the rest of the world, the rest of the region, or even how Syria has worked in the past. One of my biggest critiques is it's just you don't take a broad enough picture. And what I'd like to do today is take a much broader picture. And I'll briefly discuss Syria, which will hopefully not piss off people enough that they leave the chat. But then I want to sort of step back and just look a little more seriously, and I think in ways that everyone can agree if they just look at it, and just look at what a horrific development on the geopolitical stage this war in Syria has been, and how extraordinarily negative its effects have been everywhere. And whether you think Assad is Hitler or whether you think that everyone who opposes him is a member of Al Qaeda, I think we can all agree that this has just been such an extraordinary disaster, and how it is in everybody's benefit, absolutely everybody's benefit, to make sure that things like this simply don't happen again. And that's not just on the US and Turkey and the Gulf states. That's also on, Assad and the folks who've supported them. It is just in the entire world's interest that this sort of thing never happens again. And I think it's worth going through this and sort of discussing what happened. In Syria, in 2011, we had a sort of Arab Spring type situation evolve. The extent to which that was a homegrown thing or a exterior motivated thing is extremely controversial to this day. I do believe it was a homegrown thing. I think that the Arab Spring was one of the most inspiring things that has happened in my adult life, and it was a fantastic thing. However, there's a sort of I can't recall who it was who laid this out so brilliantly. It wasn't me, but if you look at how the Arab Spring worked, it was very interesting because very quickly a bunch of U.S. allied strongmen dropped, just fell extraordinarily quickly. The Ben Ali in Tunisia, very much sort of Western aligned, I guess probably a little more French aligned, but that's sort of second order. Tunisia wasn't a big focus for us. But Hosni Mubarak, the guy who was in charge of Egypt, had very much been the U.S.'s boy forever, fell very quickly. Also Saleh in Yemen, I believe it took about a year for him to fully give up everything and flee the country. But by very early in 2011, Saleh was putting up with a much more vigorous democratic push. This is in Yemen, from the street. And this all happened very, very quickly, and was just this extraordinary sea change in the way that the world had viewed the Arab world. And certainly in U.S., Washington, D.C., it was like, what the hell is happening? All these dictators we've funded and kept there forever, they're just falling apart. This is terrible. And what happened was some folks in Washington, D.C. were like, well, yeah, but we can make this work to our advantage. I mean, sure, Gaddafi is, basically signed on to be our bitch a while, 7 years back. But we've always hated Gaddafi. We can use this as an excuse to overthrow Gaddafi, and also we can use this as an excuse to overthrow Assad. And I'm not saying that there were not very legitimate resistance movements against Gaddafi and Assad. They're terrible people, but I think it's important to realize that the Arab Spring was instantly successful in getting rid of U.S. aligned dictators, which should just give you an indication of just how weak and shallow their control and legitimacy in these countries were. It took, I believe, I should have looked this up, 6 to 8 months to get rid of Gaddafi in Libya, and obviously Assad is still with us today. So there's just this very conscious, you know what? Fuck it. We're gonna pour tons of money and resources, and in Libya, an actual invasion, into overthrowing these guys to sort of make this what the Arab Spring was about. And I think that instinct on the part of Washington, D.C., combined with the sort of very enthusiastic sort of Metternich-style counter-revolutionary policy that Saudi Arabia and the UAE have been running, that's why the Arab Spring was a failure. So what would have happened in Syria specifically if the United States had simply not dealt with this, had simply not decided to dive in, had simply not decided Assad had to go, had simply not started arming the rebels, had simply not started working with all the Gulf states to make the revolution as evil as possible? What if none of that had happened? What if, the U.S. had just been like, well, this is certainly a strange switch of affairs. Let's, see what can happen diplomatically. But the U.S. really couldn't do that because we've systematically destroyed the State Department and the diplomatic capabilities of the United States of America. That has obviously been taken to an extreme in the Trump administration, but that was something that had been happening for quite a long time throughout the war on terror. So, but what if? What if the U.S. had just said, well, let's try to move forward and make the region happier and healthier, and simply not poured all of the resources and greenlit, and not just greenlit, but encouraged Turkey, the Gulf states, what have you, to pour all of these resources into destroying Syria. If they hadn't done that, I think what we would have seen would have been pretty horrific. We would have seen Assad do a mix of things, and he did. What's often ignored is that in 2011, 2012, he mixed repression with concession. This is a dynamic that you see in really every country in the world. I spent a lot of time studying the 19th century, and what's interesting is, this is a dynamic that we're encouraging in Saudi Arabia right now. Is what happens is there's pressure from below for change. So the dictator, person in charge, king, monarch, what have you, kills the people in charge and then makes some concessions. And that's what would have happened in Syria. And I think maybe 10,000 Syrians, as many as 10,000 Syrians could have been murdered by the Assad regime. It's absolutely true that the Assad regime is a dark, grim thing. Assad is, the hereditary successor of his father, which is just gross in and of itself. That's sort of, dictator slash monarchy. Nasty, violent place. The horrible prison that we hear about absolutely predated the 2011 Arab Spring. Of course, it's gotten dramatically more horrific. Sednaya, is that a TV star? Anyway, so it's like horrible. What has happened to Assad is like horrible, horrible stuff. I do want to say, wow, I saw a big super chat. Thank you so much, Mike No-Go Zones. I want to answer that question, but I would hold off on the super chats until after I finish the presentation. I'm going to jaw for a half hour to 45 minutes on the presentation, and then I will do Q&A for an hour, hour and a half. And that's the point, to come in with the super chats. Thank you so much, Mike No-Go Zones. Says, Robert, you're 100% correct on Syria. I'm one of the few Americans who have been in Syria and filmed a documentary. Love to chat with you about your experience on the air one day. But thanks, Mike No-Go Zones. That's happy to hear. But yeah, hold off on super chats till the end. The Syria, Assad, bad man. We made him worse. If we had not decided to turn the place into a jihadi hell, what I think would have happened would have been by this point, Assad would have made some slight reforms and would have been sort of grudgingly be allowed back into the world community after killing maybe 10,000 people. It's important to remember that Sisi of Egypt, who's supposedly our guy over in the Middle East, killed 1,000 people within his first week in power. This is not without precedent that a dictator would do some horrible thing and then things would go back to normal. This has actually happened in Syria. I think his father killed 20,000 people in Hama or something like that. Anyway, so this would have been awful if Assad had killed 10,000 people. But is it better that we've now got 500,000 dead Syrians? Is it better that every large Syrian city has been destroyed, at least in part? Is it better that by some estimates, a third of the Syrian population has been displaced? A third to half of the Syrian population has been displaced, and at least a quarter has been driven out of the country. Is that better? I think that a lot of people still say, no, Assad's a bad man, so it's better. And I've got some videos that attack that proposition, point out that actually if we'd really wanted regime change in Syria, we knew exactly how to do that. And we didn't do that. Instead, we went for a military. We went with an approach that gave the military and the intelligence community things to do. And I find that kind of disgusting. But anyway, moving on from Syria, as unfortunately too much commentary does, of course. Moving on from Syria. Turkey. I think Turkey is the country that has been most damaged by the war in Syria in ways that do not get focused on anywhere near enough. I do not like Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. I get a lot of guff in the comments for being too friendly to Turkey, because I lived there for 6 years and I tend to see Turkey's side of things on many things. However, I am in complete agreement with many of the warmongers in Washington, D.C. in pointing out that Erdogan is just a freaking disaster. He wasn't for quite some time. I supported Erdogan until he started tear gassing me in the streets in 2013. I was in Istanbul for the Gezi Park uprising. What's interesting about Erdogan is that he is something that kind of had to happen in Turkey. Turkey was run by a very an elite that I enjoyed partying with a lot. That is very secular, very Western focused, and for about 80 years would sort of have a bit of democracy, and then there'd be a little too much religion coming up from very much the grassroots in some political actor, and then the secular Western-faced elite would crush it. And what's interesting about Erdogan is that he found the right balance, or what seemed like the right balance, from when he came to power until really the beginning of this past decade. He just started really going off the rails, becoming more authoritarian. There are plenty of people who say, "Well, this is what he was going to do all along," or what have you. But I don't necessarily believe that to be true. I think that if Turkey hadn't been extraordinarily destabilized by the war in Syria, I think Erdogan would have probably not be in power at this point, or would be sort of genially retired or in opposition and doing his yelling blowhard stuff somewhere else outside of power in Turkey. It's something that's not really quite realized is that Turkey, Erdogan, one of the reasons that the secular Western facing elite kind of hated Erdogan up until, well, probably not all the way up until 2015, but certainly up until 2013, was that Erdogan was fantastic for the Kurds. Erdogan, in addition to sort of bringing religion back into the sphere the way that many Turks wanted, and having roaring economic success, was also moving forward peace negotiations with the Kurds dramatically further than they had ever been in Turkish history. It was extraordinary. It was possible for this is direct from sort of old-fashioned secular Turkish elite types saying that he was solving the problem. And I remember one friend of mine saying very poignantly, "It's like, God, I wish Gezi Park had just happened like 2 years later, like after this sort of deal had been made." Because what happened after Gezi Park, and was emphasized very strongly in 2015, was that Erdogan started losing a lot of the support that he had had. And one of the aspects of this, in an election in 2015, he lost his parliamentary majority. This was extraordinary. I was there. I was literally dancing in the streets in June of 2015. One of the reasons he lost that is because a Kurdish political party had been allowed under Erdogan to participate in Turkish politics. And it leaped over a sort of boundary where it was going to have representation in parliament. And from June until 2015, in June of 2015, it really looked like Erdogan was going to fall out of power. He was not. He is obviously still in power because of the war in Syria, because of the tension and disaster that the war in Syria had created. He was able to use that war in Syria to exacerbate tensions with the Kurds within Turkey. If it weren't for the war in Syria, if it weren't for the fact that PKK-aligned elements in northern Syria became the big U.S. allies against ISIS, if it weren't for all of those horrific developments, then Erdogan would not have been able to stay in power. It was what he did. He lost this election in June of 2015, lost his parliamentary majority to a sort of old secular elite party rump, the GHP, the Kurdish party, the HDP, and the Nationalist Party, the MHP. And what he has done in the 5 years since is he has made the MHP, the Nationalist Party in Turkey, a firm part of his coalition. And in doing that, in maintaining power, in making the nationalists like his boys, he has done a couple of things, mostly victimizing the Kurds. And the nationalists, I think probably on balance, do enjoy this sort of neo-Ottoman horseshit. This like, oh, we're taking territory in Syria. these options, these opportunities for Erdogan to take over the nationalist element in Turkish electoral politics would not have existed if it were not for the Syrian war. So it's really it's really key part of the reason that Turkey is as fucked up as it is right now is the Syrian Civil War, and that's just something that people just don't really think through enough. If Erdogan was still in power today, I don't think he would have been without the Syrian Civil War, but he would be a vastly different animal. One of the reasons that Erdogan has been able to sort of act so aggressively, call him the Slap'em Pasha, the Captain Ottoman Slap, is because of the things he has to hold over his traditional sponsors in the United States and Europe. The refugee crisis, which we will talk about a lot in this presentation, has been hanging him back from the refugee crisis has been something he can hold over Europe. If you don't give me more money and let me talk all my shit and do whatever I want, well, then I'm just going to let another million refugees go to Europe. So he's got that he can hold over Europe's head. And the United States, by the way, I've got a video coming out on Thursday. Like, the idea that Trump has somehow pulled us back from involvement in Syria it's a hoax. It's complete horseshit. The United States, more intensively earlier in the decade under Obama, but very much still today, the United States still wants to work with Turkey to overthrow Assad, to fight the Islamic State, whatever. And that is something that Erdogan's always been able to hold over the United States. So that's how Erdogan has been able to just be as aggressive and out there and involved in geopolitics as he has been, because of the opening that he was given by the war in Syria. And yeah, it's been a tremendously bad thing for Turkey. I mean, Turkey, with the exception of Cyprus, so Turkey for Cyprus was what, 73, 74? So for almost half a century, and for half a century before Cyprus, Turkey had not been involved internationally, had not been doing much intervening. That has changed. That is a dramatic shift. I feel like there's a lot of people in the U.S. who just look at this and just sort of really dumb, like Islamophobic, lens. Like, oh, he's becoming, he's evil and he's Muslim and he wants to become an Ottoman emperor and blah 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 blah. But nobody's really looking at the reasons why Erdogan was given the opportunities to act in this fashion, and it's all about Syria. Okay, I think that's Turkey. Let's talk about Iran and what the reaction, what has happened because of the war in Syria. There's this really ridiculous fallacy that sort of Obama was some kind of shrinking violet and didn't pursue the dumbest of U.S. interests in the most violent of ways, and he absolutely did. What's fascinating is, does anybody remember the Green Movement? This was something that we used to talk about a lot in the United States. But basically, in June of 2019, the Iranian people took to the streets in great numbers because it was perceived that the Iranian government had stolen an election. And what's fascinating is this was a club to beat Obama with, because people were like, why didn't Obama support the Green Movement more? Why didn't, the only reason the Green Movement in Iran existed is because Obama was president. What Obama did was, I think they call it his apology tour or what have you. He opened his presidency by, I think he did a speech in Cairo or something along those lines. It's sort of like, oh, we're gonna reestablish this relationship with the Muslim world. And he was elected with a mandate to withdraw from Iraq. So with this, it was extraordinary. It was almost immediate. And this was the case in the 90s as well with, what was his name? Khatami was the reform president back then. The second a US president stopped talking about how much he wanted to destroy Iran and stopped taking actions like, invading Iran's next door neighbors, like within 6 months, the Iranian theocracy was shakier than it had ever been really shakier than it had ever been. People just don't understand the extent to which the Iranian theocracy thrives on attack. it is happiest and healthiest when the United States is doing the most that it can to destroy Iran, its people, and its allies. So there's this idea that Obama spent his whole administration just kissing Iran's ass, and that is simply not true. Iran has like one friend, like Iran is a country that is very isolated, has very few allies or folks that it is allowed to even talk with. And Syria is a country that loudly stood by Iran. Yeah, I think Iran also sent them gas and money and whatnot. But yes, Syria was one of the only countries in the world that has loudly, proudly stood by the Islamic Republic of Iran since 1979. And in 2011, Obama, whether or not he wanted to, launched a massive, sustained, multi-billion-dollar effort to destroy the Syrian government that had stood by Iran for 33 years at that point. So of course Iran was going to get involved. This is something that I emphasize over and over again, and in the videos below, it's like Iran and Russia are status quo actors in Syria. It is the United States and its allies that wanted to shake things up and destroy things. And we've very successfully shaken things up and destroyed things. So Obama did want to get the Iran nuclear deal. In order to do that, he instituted a much more successful sanctions regime certainly than Donald Trump has. But that's sort of secondary to the fact that from the second year of his presidency, Obama was working very hard to destroy one of Iran's greatest allies. This was an incredible gift to Iran's theocracy. So if this simply hadn't happened, if we had not opted to destroy Syria through this ineffective and extraordinarily violent program of sponsoring jihadists in Syria, well, then we would have knocked out one of the main props supporting the Iranian regime. So yeah, I think that this myth that Obama was friendly to the Iranians was true for about, let's see, so for 2009 and 2010, for 2 years of Obama's presidency, he was legitimately quite friendly to the Iranians. And in that 2-year period, the Iranian theocracy almost fell or came closer to falling than it had really ever. And then all of that was thrown out the window when Obama and his administration decided to go after Syria. So that's Iran. That's another big one. I do believe that if it weren't for the war in Syria, I don't know if Iran would be Switzerland right now, but I do believe that it would be run by Rouhani or an even more, a dramatically more reform-minded Rouhani or version of Rouhani. I believe there would have been a nuclear deal. I believe that we could even really be on the pathway towards peace with Iran if we hadn't decided to spend 10 years destroying one of their greatest allies. But that's what happened. Okay, Iraq. Now, Iraq is an interesting one. I have some of the worst videos on this channel have been made about Iraq. I haven't made a video on Iraq in about 4 or 5 years because I've decided I just don't fucking understand Iraq. I've made some really bad, I think in 2014, I don't take down videos that are embarrassingly bad, but I think in 2014, I made some videos about Iraq that are embarrassingly bad. I do not understand that country. I do think that the U.S. Turkish jihadi destruction of Syria had actually one positive element, which was it sort of ended the government of it was Maliki, right? Who was a sort of Shia chauvinist, who was extraordinarily abusive to the Sunni minority in Iraq, and that abuse is a reason why the Islamic State was so successful in Iraq. So I think there is a positive element of this sort of horrific nightmare that my government created in Syria and Iraq. Was Maliki did fall. Um, who knows? If these horrific wars hadn't happened, well, I guess then Mosul, Fallujah, and dozens of other cities would be on year 15 of their rebuilding instead of year 2. So I think I think probably Iraq would have been happier if this whole thing, hadn't happened. But so that was one thing that I wanted to mention because, yeah, it's a key part in the fall of the Maliki regime in Iraq. Was his utter failure to make Sunnis feel like they were a part of modern Iraq, followed by the extraordinary events of 2014 when the sort of the wayward U.S. proxy, the Islamic State, that had used the disarray in Syria to build itself up, came rampaging into Iraq, and that was the end of the Maliki government. But I do think Iraq probably would have been better off if that had never happened, even if Maliki had stayed in government. But again, I don't freaking understand Iraq, and I need to read a lot of books before I can attempt to talk about that further. Moving on to Europe. These are really straightforward, direct political results. I think after Europe, I'm going to get in a little more sort of esoteric arena, a little more sort of up in the air stuff. But this is Brexit would not have happened without the war in Syria. This is obvious and intuitive to I think most anybody. Yet it's something that never really gets mentioned because obviously the U.S. government doesn't want to think too hard about what its Get Assad project has done to its premier alliance structure in Europe and its most valuable ally. Yeah, Brexit. That's entirely down. Not entirely down. Brexit. There's reasons why folks don't like the European Union in Britain. It's a long-standing thing. But what you have to understand with the Brexit vote, this was a 2% thing. I mean, this was not. This was had the vote gone 2% in another direction, then Britain would be a member of the European Union today. And the past almost 5 years. 4.5 years of British politics, pointless British politics, would not have happened that way. Europe could potentially have been, on its way to recovery, economic and political recovery, and some consolidation prior to the coronavirus crisis that it's currently experiencing. But no, because of the refugee crisis, this refugee crisis that was created by United States policy. First, the destruction of Libya, and then the destruction of Syria. It's true that if Syria had not been destroyed and Libya had been destroyed, there still would have been a refugee crisis in Europe. It would not have been to anywhere near the scale. And I think also if Syria had not been destroyed, there's some other aspects of Libya and Yemen that would have been very different. So that refugee crisis it's funny. It's 5 years ago now, and folks, it's incredible just how dominating it was of the headlines, and it was extraordinarily destabilizing, not just in Britain with the Brexit vote, but across Europe. So yeah, Brexit, 2% of the vote had been different. If we hadn't had this extraordinary refugee crisis, that 2% would have been, Britain would be in the EU today, and that refugee crisis is a direct result of U.S., Saudi, Turkish policy in Syria. What's interesting is Hungary and Poland. If I looked into the elections a little bit here, Viktor Orban has been the prime minister of Hungary since 2010, and he's always been, sort of right-wing, quasi-authoritarian type of guy. But I think there's also I think it's fair to say that both Poland and Hungary, to differing degrees, have been given a bit of a bad rap. The governments that are currently governing them, it's democracy. Like the Polish and Hungarian people should be able to make decisions through democracy that maybe the EU doesn't like, or maybe aren't as friendly to Brussels. That's fine, and I think that we're perhaps a little too eager to call the Polish and Hungarian governments authoritarian or dictatorial when they're acting in legal constitutional ways. That said, I do believe that there are aspects of what the Hungarian and Polish governments have been doing, just as I firmly believe there are aspects to what the Trump, Obama, Bush, Clinton, all the way back to Washington administrations, the United States government does, that are authoritarian. There are elements of what the Hungarian and Polish governments have been doing that are authoritarian and should be condemned. What's underappreciated about the authoritarianism of those countries is that it is much more, probably even more so than in British politics, it is rooted in the fear of the other, the fear of the Muslim refugee. And it is something that, I mean, obviously that's not a positive instinct that we should encourage. However, it is an understandable aspect of their politics, and it has made these parties with authoritarian leanings lean further towards authoritarianism. And, I mean, there's multi-dynamics here, and made them more likely to win elections. What's interesting is in 2010, Orban won with 52% of the vote. In 2014, that vote share had fallen down to 44%. I believe either through just parliamentary systems are of infinite complexity. 40%, 44% is still a very good result. However, it is clear that between 2015 and 2014, his support was declining, which is natural. If you're in power for a while, there tend to be more scandals. You tend to run out of steam. You've done the things you wanted to do that were useful or were not useful or were powerful. People get sick of you. That happens. By 2014, Orban, had lost 8% of his vote share. By 2018, after the refugee crisis, and Orban really distinguished himself in being more xenophobic than most, his vote share went up 5%. And of course, by 2018, he's been in power for a decade, and he has been changing the system so as to privilege himself and his party, and he's becoming more problematic. Orban, I think, would have been gone without the Syrian war and the refugee crisis. And the same, I think, to a lower extent, is the same with the PiS. It's always fun to say the PiS, the Law and Justice Party in Poland, which did not come to power until now. The PiS Party is long established in Poland. I think they had a brief period of time where they had a prime minister back in the aughts. Don't quote me on that. But they came rampaging back to power in October 2015, when the refugee crisis was the dominating political issue in Europe. So these effects are real. Like this has made the Syrian Civil War has been a huge factor in making you incredibly weak. It's been so destructive, and the knock-on effects from that are infinite. Let's talk about Libya and Yemen. These are two other horrific disasters focuses on a lot, and they have been. Come on, why is my connection unstable? Don't do this to me. Come on. Okay, I'm back. In 2011, when Gaddafi and Saleh fell, there was a period of time after each of those falls where it seemed like maybe there'd be some kind of system that would function in Libya and Yemen. And it was cautious optimism was possible. I had friends who work for NGOs, nonprofits, I don't know, probably various spy agencies, who lived in Libya and Yemen in that period, 2011 and 2014, like lived openly and were able to try to provide services, help develop a democratic system there. And in 2014 and 2015, those places sort of fell into a complete disarray. And now you can only describe what's going on there as open civil war. And what's interesting there is that if Syria hadn't been such an obvious, open, and horrific proxy war, I think the chances are that Libya and Yemen's democratic transitions would have had a bigger chance to actually work. Because by 2014, we're operating in a context where it's very transparently obvious that Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and the United States are pouring a ton of resources into destroying Syria, Russia and Iran, one of Russia and Iran's only clear allies. So Russia and Iran get a lot more interested in pouring resources into fucking up Yemen and Libya. And that is sort of the genesis. I read a book recently where it's pretty clear that before 2011, the Houthis were a factor and a more and more powerful factor in Yemen from 2004 through 2011. And the Houthis were always very interested in soliciting aid from Iran. And maybe some of it did come in trickles. But before 2011 and the eager Saudi attempt to destroy Iran's ally in Syria, Iran was very standoffish from that. They weren't interested in funneling large volumes of arms to the Houthis in Yemen. After 2011, well, the gloves came off. And the Houthis that had prior to actually after 2011, they also did participate in sort of dialogue and what have you. But they became less and less as the support from Iran escalated, as the attempts to destroy Assad escalated in that sort of 2011-2014 period. The Houthis got more and more support from the Iranians and became less and less interested in attempting to be a part of a diplomatic transition for the whole country. Similar dynamics were happening in the much smaller and much more complex Libyan context. So if things weren't so awful and if things weren't fucking up relations between the proxy warring powers in Syria to such an extraordinary degree, I believe Yemen and Libya probably would have been in much better shape. Here's one very concrete reaction that that I hadn't mentioned yet. Donald Trump would not be president of the United States without the Syrian Civil War. If the Get Assad project had not happened, Donald Trump would not be president. While the US was always shamefully neglectful in the amount of refugees that we took in from the Syrian conflict, it was a huge political issue in the United States in 2015, 2016. ISIS, which is basically a US proxy force that got out of hand. If you dispute that, I've got a video laying that out in great detail under this viewing window. ISIS was a huge part of Donald Trump's election. I challenge you to find a Donald Trump ad from 2015 that didn't mention ISIS or refugees in some respect. I mean, this was a key part of his appeal. And again, as with Brexit, Trump won by an extraordinarily slim margin. A lot of his victory had to do with the fact that everybody hates Hillary Clinton. A lot of it had to do with inequality. A lot of it had to do with racism. However, ISIS, foreign policy, refugees were a huge part of his appeal as well. And I think really, if you tot it all up, he won. His electoral college victory came about because of 50,000 votes in a country of 300 million. If the Islamic State had not existed, if the massive refugee crisis had not happened, if these two things that US policy had not created had not happened, Donald Trump would not be president. So, yeah, that's kind of a big deal. I mean, and the last one is this gets to the sort of just the general tenor of politics of world politics that the Syrian war created. If it weren't for what was happening in Syria, would Ukraine have gone the same way? That's the one that I'm least. I'm not sure, honestly. Like, would Ukraine have been as bitter? Would Russia have been as willing to send in proxy forces and whatnot, and little green men and whatnot, if we didn't have the example of Syria? I'm not certain. Would if Syria wasn't going on, would the U.S. intelligence freaks be as eager and willing to support the Ukrainian opposition to the degree that it did? Like, would any of that have happened if it weren't for the horrors of the Syrian Civil War? I don't know. China and the Uyghurs. This one just popped in my head this morning, and like, what do you think the Chinese government is afraid of with the Uyghurs. Obviously, like China has a number of horrific elements in its ideology or whatnot that would have led to this anyway. But what's interesting is actually their treatment of the Uyghurs and now also of Mongolians and the Hui and a whole bunch of other peoples is actually there's been a big switch in China over the past decade. Even under Chairman fucking Mao, there was a lot of lip service because this is part of sort of 20th century communist ideology. And the way that the Soviet Union and the Chinese justified the fact that they had old-fashioned empires was they had this exaggerated respect for nationalities and the idea of national cultures and the parliament of nations that are all just pulling together for this grand communist goal. Yeah, China's abandoning that entirely. And what do you think? What do you think in the halls of power in Beijing? What do you think the main example they look at when they're like, "Oh yeah, we should probably crush this this religious view, this view of the people in these sections"? What do you think they're looking at? They're looking at Syria. They're looking at the way that the United States, the Gulf countries, and Turkey weaponized Islam, weaponized well, in Syria, it's not a minority, it's a majority, a Sunni majority, weaponized this religious persuasion and way of looking at the world that was different from the folks in power in Syria. Like when China justifies its genocidal campaigns in Xinjiang, and I'm absolutely not saying that this justifies China's genocidal campaigns in Xinjiang, but when they were formulating it, when people in the Chinese Communist Party were like, hey, you know, this kind of goes against what we've said for quite some time, and aren't there sort of public relations negatives to this? I think the main argument that the folks in the Chinese Communist Party who wanted to genocide the Uyghurs, the main argument that they used to steamroll the folks in China who, you know, wanted to not become famous for genociding the Uyghurs, the main argument they probably used was Syria. Look at what's happening in Syria. Look at what's happening with Assad in Syria. So yeah, I think that if it weren't for this horrific Syrian civil war, then yeah, the world would be a dramatically better, happier, safer place. I mean, it's documented the way that the Syrian civil war and the Libya, the way that we screwed Russia and China and the Security Council over Libya, sort of telling them, no, it's just a humanitarian thing. I swear we're not going to try to overthrow Gaddafi. And Russia and China were like, okay, we'll give you a Security Council resolution. And we'll say in it, we're definitely not here to overthrow Gaddafi. And we're like, sure, cool. And then we went and overthrew Gaddafi. Like, this is why things are as fucked up now, you know? And it didn't have to be like this. I think we don't really recall that, you know, in 2010, like Russia and China were not quasi-rogue states. They were not, you know, people like to talk about how the world's getting more dangerous, and I think that's largely horseshit. But to the extent that it is true, the extent that China and Russia are acting out in ways where they want to exert themselves, like it's a reaction to what the United States did to Syria, and I don't think that's appreciated enough. And what's also just so infuriating is that we can still like stop at any time. We can just be like, yo, okay, we failed to destroy Syria. We failed to destroy Assad. Let's let him do his thing and, you know, funnel a couple $2 billion into rebuilding the place, or stop prosecuting people who want to help rebuild Syria. We could do that at any time, and that would actually make a lot of things better. But we won't, because, you know, we're dumb. Anyway. So that's what I have to say about the Syrian Civil War and what the world might have been like without it. Do we have questions? Do we have questions? Now would be the point. If you wanted to get super chatting, I am more likely to read your question if you add a super chat to it. But I'm just going to answer any questions. Oh my gosh, yes. Bolivia. Before I get into Q&A, Bolivia. Bolivia is really, really exciting. For those of you who are not aware, in the community page, I put up like a half-hour update. Not update. This is from a year ago. So basically, in November of 2019, the Trump administration allied with the Organization of American States and a range of elements within Bolivia, who turns out are not as powerful as they thought they were, basically did a coup in Bolivia. There were reasons that why Evo Morales had opened himself up for this. Tremendously successful socialist-leaning president of Bolivia, tripled the GDP, was really great for indigenous people, which is not something that is often the case in Latin America. So pretty great. Did absolutely have some strongman leanings. He wanted to run again, even though the Constitution said he shouldn't. He lost a referendum saying he shouldn't run. So yeah, I mean, Evo Morales is not a flawless character. However, the Trump administration, the Organization of American States, and the United and what's the word? And folks in Bolivia should not have done a coup in reaction to Evo Morales being a little fast and loose with the Constitution on the question of whether he should stay in power. Bolivia is a democracy, has been a democracy for, oh gosh, I don't recall exactly when the last dictatorship was. But there was a functioning democratic system that Morales was, maybe abusing a little bit. The response to that, for the love of Christ, is not destroying a democratic system. But that's what Trump decided to do Trump and, more his cronies, sort of Elliot Abrams, whatnot. And it's just part of this really shitty Trump administration thing where they're like, oh, let's pretend it's the 1980s again, which is just really dumb because there's a horrific, extensive history of the United States overthrowing governments and kicking around in Latin America that had sort of faded away. Yes, there was Obama might have done something in Honduras or whatever. But generally, you compare okay, for the past 20 or 30 years, you can really only point to a failed Bush coup in Venezuela in 2004 and maybe something that Clinton and Obama did in Honduras in 2012. The idea that over 2 or 3 decades, you can only point to 2 things, look at the fucking 1980s, man, or the 70s or the 60s, the 50s, 40s, 30s. So anyway, the United States had really sort of just gotten out of the coup business. And Trump has been gotten into the coup business in Latin America, which was great. And Trump has been oh no, let's do more of it. And very ill-advisedly did one in November of 2019, bringing to power Janine Áñez and a openly racist, maybe fascist, probably fair, openly racist, unelected system where they, we're going to have an election in 3 months. We're going to have an election in 6 months. They basically were, she came to power with the understanding that there was going to be an election in 3 months. We finally had the election almost a year later this past weekend. And she was awful. There were definitely massacres. She was attempting to not just, Morales fled the country. She was attempting to ban his very popular party, supported by at least 50% of the people. Over 50%, as we now know. And yeah, she was just awful. And of course, instantly reversing with no democratic mandate a lot of Morales's choices on how to run the government, how to run the petroleum industry, how to this, that, and the other thing. Tremendously successful choices, I would add. Bolivia's GDP tripled. This is not a Maduro situation where some dumbass socialist gets in there and destroys the state oil company. As was the case in Venezuela. This was an extraordinarily successful country that made a lot of poor, suffering people happier and richer. And the Trump administration opted to help the old white elite in Bolivia try to destroy that. And as of last, Sunday evening, it seems very likely that they have failed. They have failed miserably. Trump and co. and Janine Áñez and all these other folks fucking failed. Actually, kind of did a favor to the Evo Morales and his party, the MAS. This would not have been a great year for the MAS to be in power. So this fascist dictatorship basically took power just in time to extraordinarily mismanage the coronavirus crisis. So weirdly, sort of kind of helped. So Louis Arce, and it's actually also a good result too, because Louis Arce is now Arce. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing it. I apologize for that. The guy who's supposedly the architect of Morales's economy is now the president, and Morales is probably going to come back and be like, "Hey, I'm back. It's great." And Louis Arce is going to be like, "Welcome back. I'm the president." So yeah, I think Bolivia has been put in weirdly in sort of a happier position, but that's an extraordinary accident of history. There are many, 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 many ways that this could have gotten much more poorly. And it is a fantastic victory for Bolivia, for Latin America, and for the world to see democracy work in this way. If I didn't say it, yeah, Luis Arce, it's now clear that he won 50% of the vote, which is just over 50% of the vote in the initial election. It's a system where it seemed possible that there would be a runoff, and according to a lot of polling, he wouldn't have won. There was like sort of like a somewhat more acceptable neoliberal guy that, if there was a runoff, he would have gotten the votes for all the fascists that were, and maybe he would have ended up being the president. But no, like the people were like, give us back those folks we had for 14 years who tripled our GDP, and get rid of these motherfuckers who have overseen the destruction of our country. And yeah, so that's Bolivia is pretty fantastic. It is nice to get reminders that the ballot box can be an incredibly powerful thing. Democracy can be an incredibly powerful thing. So yeah, Bolivia, awesome. Questions? Kayachenke's Storenzo, kendi Turk mu istiyorum yoksa bakış? Okay, I can't really speak Turkish. Anyway, More Freedom Foundation from Humper Biden. Oh, that's funny. Do you expect more Syria-type situations, aka civil war, in future in the Asian region due to China-U.S. competition? Can Cold War 2.0 be avoided? That's a really, really good question. It's interesting because I do think that by and large, there's a lot of countries that are much stronger, have a stronger democratic tradition in Asia than there are in the Middle East. So it is more difficult to destroy the countries in this fashion. I mean, that said, you look at Indonesia. I think I did a video called Indonesia is Amazing years back, where it's just like, on paper, that place should have dissolved into, horrific civil war. I think it did to an extent in East Timor, but, from the 1960s and just never stopped. It's an extraordinarily diverse place that has been somehow sort of maneuvered into a functioning democracy of over 200 million people. But it still functions. I do wonder a little bit about Cambodia or Laos. I think they're sort of vaguely authoritarian, pretty poor places that could be destabilized fairly straightforwardly. So yeah, I don't know, but I don't think there's as fertile a ground for disruption as there is in the Middle East, because I think that even the more authoritarian, dictatorial type situations, like say Vietnam, have just infinitely more legitimacy and than a lot of Middle East governments, because they actually have to govern. It's just a lot of rent seeking by a lot of Middle East governments, whether it's petroleum based or catering to the petroleum based powers in the country. Like there's a lot of it's easier, I think, to knock over a Middle Eastern country. I really hope we don't end up in proxy warring in Asia. That would be a tremendous tragedy. I hope we don't end up with more proxy warring anywhere. I think the main place where I think I could conceivably see U.S.-China proxy wars, maybe not this decade, maybe in the next decade, would be Africa. And that seems like a real bad thing. One of the happiest things about the African story, there are 54 African countries, and all of them are very different. But in broad strokes, the 54 countries on the African continent have been very lucky in that there has not been a Cold War for the past 30 years. That, of course, combined with the growing pains of independence, plus having the Soviets and the CIA, having the KGB and the CIA working overtime to set up their own proxies or set up militias to fight the other to fight the governments that were openly aligned with the other side. I mean, just tremendously destructive um, uh, for 4 decades for Africa, for the 54 African countries. And an extraordinary part of African development over the past 30 years, which has been real, which has been impressive in some countries, less impressive in others. People like to talk about cell phones or, new technologies and how that's helping. The absolute best thing that has happened for African development over the past 30 years has been the end of the Cold War and the dramatic fall in the number of ongoing civil wars and destabilization. One of the really horrifying things is that the war on terror has sort of allowed the U.S. and France to sort of set up a lot of. I mean, there are U.S. special forces all over Africa training the militaries of some, fairly democratic leaning systems, but a lot of strongmen too. And it's fucked up because they're just waiting there. The U.S. and France have thrown a Cold War, but nobody's showed up to fight them yet. But it would be a tremendous waste of time and a crime against humanity. But I can imagine by the next decade, by the end of this decade or the next decade, China could start showing up with its own, start joining in a new African Cold War, and that would be tremendously tragic. Local Cool Extreme asks, More Freedom Foundation, will you apologize for your atrocious TikTok? Yeah, I don't know, man. I do have a TikTok now. It's bad. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I did. I guess I'm not. I'm an old white guy. I'm not allowed to lip sync African American people, am I? That is pretty fucked up. Maybe I should delete that one. I don't know. Hey, man, I'm just trying to get people to look at my shit. So I do have a TikTok. I think it's More Freedom Foundation. And yeah, that's my attempt to use a new platform, and it sucks a lot. Anyway, Flash Gordon asks, doesn't Russia have anything to do with the trouble in Syria? Russia is, Flash Gordon, yeah, I've got a video covering this. But yeah, Russia definitely has something to do with the trouble in Syria. They're supporting an ally. Russia has had its only external naval base? Maybe there's another one in Syria since the 1970s in Tartus. So yeah, what do you think? Well, actually, we know what would happen when the surrounding neighbors tried to destroy Qatar, a place where we had bases. And even though those countries that wanted to destroy Qatar, this is in 2016, were our allies, we were like, fuck no, you're not going to do that. And because we're the United States, we go, fuck no, you're not going to do that. We tried to destroy Syria. And Russia waited 4 years as the country fell into really horrific disarray before jumping in a minor way. And honestly, after Russia jumped in, if you look at the casualty figures from 2015, I think it's kind of got better pretty quickly. There was refugees did spike briefly. Things got a lot worse, but by the end of 2016, the Russian intervention had actually ended up sort of bringing the more active stages of the Syrian war to an end. So, yeah, Russia did have anything to do with the trouble in Syria, and it had a lot to do with calming it down. Questions. Oh boy, where are we? Oh dear. Questions. Charles Burrows asks, why do you think the Kurds haven't been able to get more international support for them to create Kurdistan? Because realigning, because erasing borders, fucking with borders, is how you get disasters. I think that's pretty clear. Iraqi Kurdistan has gotten a lot of international support, but even folks who support Iraqi Kurdistan in the United States do not want Iraqi Kurdistan to declare independence, because if they do that, then the Kurdish part of Iran might declare independence. And I think that's Europe is a very weird place where a series of horrific genocides over the course of the late 19th and early 20th century not just carried out by the Nazis, not just the Armenian genocide. There's a lot of genocide going on. I just watched an extraordinary film called, it's like, I don't care if they call us barbarians, about the Romanian genocide of Jews and others in during World War II. So Europe is this very weird place where, because of horrific crimes, there is some kind of ethnic homogeneity in those countries, and not even. I mean, there's Roma. There are many. I mean, Hungary wants to annex half of its neighbors. There's even there, ethnicity isn't quite sort of handled out. So the only sane way to look at where borders are today is to say that's where the borders are. That is where the borders should stay. There are not just Kurds in the areas of Iraq, Syria, Iran, and Turkey that folks want to make Kurdish. I think what we understood in certainly in the aftermath of World War II, and I think throughout much of the 20th century, was that if you attempt to, it sounds all very well and good to say, the Kurdish people, or the South Sudanese people, or the Sudeten German people, or the Hungarian people in Romania deserve their freedom but nobody really thinks it through. Like, what does it mean for the Assyrian Christians in all of these places? What is it in all of these Kurdish places? What does it mean for the Yazidis in all of these places? Yeah, I mean, it means that when we put borders up in the air, it means that states get genocidal. Yeah, no, it's just a bad idea all around. So yeah, I think that's why Kurdistan hasn't had too much support for the idea of an independent Kurdistan. The biggest, and actually, I do think this was probably a good thing. I'm still reading up on it, but the biggest example of okay, let's give these people who deserve a country in the past 10 years was South Sudan. And South Sudan finally, after a century, depends on how you measure it, sort of where you define, what is Sudan's government. But yeah, the folks of South Sudan have fought long and hard, are ethnically different from the folks in Sudan, and be through, I think, probably some significantly Islamophobic support that they got from the US government and a lot of celebrities. South Sudan became independent in 2013, 2014, and immediately fell into a horrific civil war. Like, just awful. Hundreds of thousands dead. So yeah, and I think that's actually, South Sudan probably should have been independent. So yeah, like, fucking with borders, and that's one of the reasons why I hate my Iraq. I think back in 2014, at the height of the ISIS thing, I was like, let's just split up Iraq, and I think that's insane. I think that's dumb. I think revising borders is how you get genocides. That's why I don't support an independent Kurdistan. Damn it, there was a super chat here, and I did not have. There it is. Thank you. Fogneber says independent Kurd movements are being propelled by Western intelligence agencies. I think that's true. I mean, yeah, fuck yeah. Over the past 10 years, Fogneber is 100% right. The extent to which the Western media just sort of goes, and the Turks don't really like our brave Kurdish allies in Syria. Like, no, it's not they don't really like our brave Kurdish allies in Syria are allied with the PKK that has killed like 40,000 people in Turkey over the past couple decades. So yeah, absolutely. Western intelligence agencies have 100% been propping up independent Kurdish movements over the past 10 years, which is at the root of a lot of Turkish anger at the United States. But I don't think generally, like, I mean, Kurds are a real people. Like, they have, I mean, it is interesting in Turkey the way that I dated a girl who was Kurdish whenever Erdogan had done some nasty thing, and then was Kurdish when Erdogan had done something nasty to the Kurds. And then the next day, if the PKK did something really nasty some terrorist bombing or something, she was proudly Turkish. So yeah, I mean, but identity is identity. People, there are plenty. I mean, she could do that because she just the way that she looked. There are people who are Kurdish who can't make that choice. But I don't know. It's well, actually, not really. Anyway, that's getting into an arena I don't need to get into right now. But the Kurds are a people. They have a language. It should be respected. I am a fan of some degree of what was developing before Erdogan decided he needed nationalists. I'm perfectly fine with there being Kurdish parties in Turkey. I think that's great. But that participate in democratic elections and have control of Kurdish majority regions in a democratic sense. That's fine. That's not something that Turkey is currently fine with, and of course that ends up with more bloodshed. So I don't know. But no, I don't think it's just that independent Kurd movements are being propelled by Western intelligence agencies. I think there's a lot more to it than that. The Kurdish aspirations are real and should be respected. That does not mean that they should be given a country carved out of other people. Damn it! There we go. Brando Commando. Could Egypt be the next country to undergo regime change? The damming of the Nile by Ethiopia and Sudan looks troubling for the economic and domestic stability. I need to read up more about the Nile Dam. I still haven't. My take on Egypt has always been really negative, or at least since Sisi came to power. It just looks, I see Sisi up there, and it just looks like the Shah of Iran. Like, he killed 1,000 people when he came to power. He's extraordinarily repressive. You don't tamp down sort of religiously conservative instincts like that and not get an outburst. I think when I think about it more deeply, I don't think it's possible to have quite as extreme a reaction as we had that founded the Islamic Republic of Iran. I mean, the literacy levels were extraordinarily low. I don't think that I kind of have this hunch that religious extremism as a reaction to Western imperialism has sort of run its course because it's been kind of a dramatic failure. So I don't think, while I've been sort of glib in saying that Sisi looks like the Shah of Iran to me, like I don't think we're going to get like an Egyptian caliphate or something after him, but I do think we're going to get something after him, and I do think we're going to get it violently, and I don't think that whatever comes after Sisi is going to be anywhere near as friendly to U.S. and Israeli interests as Sisi has been. So yeah, it could be. I mean, when I say regime change, I'm usually thinking of U.S. or other country motivated attempt to destroy a group that's a leadership group. But yeah, in a very limited sense, that yes, I do believe that Egypt is a very unstable country that we should, over the next 10 years or so, we should probably see some kind of big nasty change in. So yeah, I don't know, or I could be completely wrong about that. I don't have with Saudi Arabia, I'd say very confidently that place will be run by a very different system by 2030. And that's based on a lot of in-depth reading, and I'm like, okay, I feel like I have some sense of this country, and I think I'm right about this. Egypt, it's more of a hunch. I mean, Egypt is a country of 100 million people with a very deep history that I have started beginning to dive into on this channel. I did a sort of two-parter on the sort of failed Egyptian revolution against British influence in the late 19th century. Actually, some of the videos I've done this year that I'm most proud of. I should check those out. Yeah, I don't know enough about Egypt to say 100% conclusively Sisi's days are numbered, but I have a hunch that Sisi's days are numbered. Okay, questions. Logo Cool Extreme asks, why is the Trump administration actively disrupting COVID relief efforts? And why is he too stupid to take a stimulus deal before the election? The dude's a moron, there's if you go back to 2017, me and my buddy Ray, I was like, oh no, this is scary. He's really gonna uh, uh, he's really gonna. I completely lost my thread of thought. What was I talking about here? Um, Sorry, I get distracted by a super chat. Yes, why is Trump? So yeah, back in 2017, I was like, no, man, like this guy, he's gonna reformat the United States and like his new racist ethno state, orientation. We're fucked. What he's gonna do is he's gonna get in here. This is what Steve Bannon wanted to do. He's gonna get in here and he's going to use the sort of racism and the violence of the traditional Republican message, but he's going to make it more European. He's going to be like, yeah, fuck the immigrants, and here's your amazing healthcare plan. This is Trump had the opportunity to truly change the way that the United States worked, and thankfully, I think he's failed miserably. The man is a fucking idiot. Again, at the beginning of the COVID thing, Steve Bannon and a lot of other right-wing types were like, oh my gosh, it's a big pandemic and it's China's fault. And Trump's like done a little bit of that. But man, like in January of 2020, Trump could have been like, look at, and he had the information in January and February 2020. He could have been like, look at the fucking virus that the Chinese are sending us. We're shutting down all immigration from everywhere. And I'm going to take this super seriously. He could have used COVID to, after floundering for 3 years, he really could have used COVID to set up a sort of more authoritarian type deal. He's tried to a limited extent with the sort of the Department of Homeland Security and cities that are run by Democrats, but it's just half-assed and it's dumb, and he doesn't have anybody who works for him. I did a video called Trump Hires the Worst People, and that's the really fundamental thing. It's like Trump, whether you think he's a great businessman or you think he's just a good shyster salesman type, has never really had more than a couple dozen people who work for him. I mean, probably in all his hotels and casinos and whatnot at high points, probably tens of thousands of people who work for him. But this is my lawyer guy. This is my manager at the Sands. This is my and that's it. I mean and everybody does what I tell them to. And some of them are talented and some of them are not talented, and that's it. Like that's all he's ever fucking had to do. Running the federal government is something that Donald Trump was completely unequal to, because he needed to have people he trusted, people who he respected, and the man neither respects nor trusts anybody. Yeah, I mean, it's been a disaster. And it's funny, like if I were a Trump supporter, I'd be really disappointed. Yeah, he's a fucking clown. The stimulus deal is like, so what he's relied on throughout his time in power is just letting the Republicans do what Republicans want to do, and then he could browbeat them into doing things that were useful to him, because they were so terrified of him. The Republicans are a lot less terrified of Trump now. I think most of them are in their. I mean, there's still a chance Trump could win. It's really unlikely at this point. Like we have one more debate on Thursday night that I will not watch. And if Joe Biden doesn't literally shit himself, like literally whip his dick out and start playing with it, because that's what he needs to do. Like he needs to just walk off the stage or just sort of stare blankly in response to a question. Like he needs to prove, if Joe Biden doesn't prove that he's seriously damaged in some way, and even if he does, I think it's very likely that Trump is going to lose. And I think Republicans are making that calculation, are saying, okay, yeah, I now see this. Like that's what's happening. So what Republicans are thinking now is they don't want to save the economy. They want Biden to have 4 disastrous years as president, overseeing a failed recovery and just a nightmare time. So the Republican, even though Trump wants a stimulus now, the Republicans are not going to give it to him because they don't have any interest in Biden's success. Okay. Fognibur asks, oh shit, where'd I put that? Is El-Sisi from the pro-Trump MBS establishment? So I think Sisi is, well, I mean, Sisi is prior to the pro-Trump MBS thing. I mean, both Trump and MBS, it's important to recognize, are quasi-revolutionary figures. Trump is a failed revolutionary, for sure. MBS, it's still open. MBS is somebody that I find appalling. I think he's disastrous, done extraordinarily disastrous things. I think he's questionably quite insane, quite possibly. Death squads, terrifying, what have you. He's kind of what Saudi Arabia, like, for Saudi Arabia to continue to exist, they needed somebody who was disruptive. They didn't need someone who was disruptive like this, but they needed some kind of disruption for the Saudi state to continue to function. So like Trump and MBS are sort of revolutionary figures that are both revolutionary, but also kind of make sense in the context of their systems and the way that their systems are evolving, that the systems of their countries are evolving in response to things that have happened, stimuli, things that it may or may not need. Sisi is none of those things. Sisi is just the newest representative of the same dipshits that have been running the country since Nasser. Nasser was a fascinating, inspiring, and ultimately failed figure. But his successors have sort of gotten less and less impressive as time has gone on. Sisi is the reassertion of the military theocracy, not theocracy, the military oligarchy that has run the country since full independence from Britain in the 1950s. He's not, he's not a good answer to anything. He's a failure of Egypt as a country and as a system. He's a sort of like, well, let's just sort of, keep things going. That's my sense. I don't know. Could be wrong. Could be very unfair. I haven't read enough books about modern Egypt, but my sense is that, he's not. Like Trump and MBS at least sort of like make a certain kind of sense and sort of like move things forward in a way, whether it's forward to a disaster that we can recover from, or it's Sisi's just sort of biding time and murdering people. Questions. I mean, folks, I love how folks are just interacting with each other. No questions for me. Oh, here we go. Logostream asks, Mo Freedom Foundation, what is the future of Steve Bannon and Stephen Miller? I was actually thinking about that recently. I have no idea. Stephen Bannon, man, like Steve Bannon, I think is independently wealthy. I don't know the details of the court case he's currently involved with. But I mean, I think Steve Bannon is having a fucking ball. Not a lot of dudes, and he's what, in his late 60s, 70s, late 60s, early 70s. Not a lot of dudes get to be that relevant at that point in their lives, and to do it from like such a crackpot way, like he had throughout the Obama years, he had some like bomb throwing piece of shit website, Breitbart, like sort of like sub Daily Show, sub Daily Show. Like I'm trying to think of like a left wing, but yeah, I mean it's like a joke site for like for brain rotted old people who believe in it. And then he managed to leverage that into being the campaign manager in a winning insurgent presidential campaign. And then I think I watched a documentary about him, and then he was just sort of traveling the world trying to put together like a right wing, like international or something like that. I mean, I think dude's having a blast. He's got great hair. And I'm very delighted that he's failed to have real national influence, and I don't think he's going to get back to having real national influence. But I think he'll be fine. Stephen Miller is a more interesting, more horrifying prospect, because that dude is young, like that dude's what, 10 years younger than I am, much more successful than I'll ever be. Like that guy. So for those of you who don't know, Stephen Miller is the guy who came up through Jeff Sessions, the Senate office of Jeff Sessions, and he's sort of at the root of one of the only things that the Trump administration has managed to do successfully, which was something they committed to, which is sort of destroy the immigration uh, machine at the heart of U.S. success. They are actually, some of the things they did around asylum, obviously not the separating children or whatnot, but some of the reforms of the asylum process may not necessarily have been the worst thing, but what they're also doing is cramping down on every form of legal immigration, booting out people who've been here for 30 years under sort of temporary protected status. Like it's really fucking appalling what Stephen Miller has been able to do, and he's a very young guy. And I think that one would hope that like he's also sort of become this sort of somewhat villainous, hate figure or whatnot. And one would hope that that would yield some kind of stigma, but I think there's probably um, enough old wealthy folks who think that crushing immigration was a successful thing to do for 4 years, that he'll probably get some kind of plum spot in some organization somewhere. Yeah, you'd like to think his career was over, but that is not the case. All right, questions. More Freedom Foundation question: is a strong Iran better for the USA or a weak one? Well, that's an interesting question. I don't think it really matters, honestly. The way I see the future of the Middle East is, I think, inevitably is going to be some kind of tug of war between Iran and Turkey. Yeah, I think that's what it was for 500 years before the British got there, and it's what it'll be, I think, after the Americans leave. And I think, of course, what role Israel or sort of Arabs more generally also get to play part of that. It was a tremendously interesting question, and we'll see how that goes in the coming decades. But yeah, like I think a strong Iran is kind of inevitable, and I think that whenever they move on to their next system after this one, which I do think is inevitable, sort of as soon as the U.S. stops giving them excuses to exist, Iran's theocratic system will evaporate pretty quickly. As soon as not as soon as maximum pressure ends. Like it's got to be like 4 or 5 years of the U.S. legitimately being like, all right, this Iran thing is fucking stupid, and I think that would very quickly yield a different system in Iran. But like it depends, like what elements of the U.S. I mean, it is a partnership between hardliners in the United States and Iran. Sort of the theocracy very much keeps a whole bunch of U.S. defense contractors and their official and unofficial employees in business, and vice versa. So yeah, like a strong Iran. I don't know. I hope that was a useful answer to that question. Question: can Palestine become a country? Well, that's something that we all believed in before Trump, but it's becoming very clear that the two-state solution seems more and more fantastical. The fact that Trump was able to be so whole hog for the Israelis with very little consequence from Palestinians or the Arab world certainly isn't going to make Israel more committed to the two-state solution. I think what we're going to see for the next decade or so is some kind of quite explicit apartheid with Israel and Palestine, followed eventually, I would hope, by a one-state solution where everybody gets a vote. What was it? Who was I talking about this with? But I think it just seems, this is not my theory. This is somebody else's, but it seems weirdly plausible to me. But when you look at how politics are developing, well, not just in Israel, but parts of Brooklyn. And it's plausible to imagine like sort of Likudniks and other elements in Israeli politics 30 years from now actually sort of desperately welcoming the Palestinians into the franchise in Israel and giving them a vote just to somehow outweigh the massively growing Orthodox Israeli population that is, I think, becoming more of a threat to the Israeli state than the Palestinians ever were. But I don't know. That's going off the reservation a bit. I don't really know. I got to stop saying that. That's a really fucked up term, isn't it? Going off the reservation. Yeah, that was more a theory that seemed amusing to me than something that I think is going to happen. But yeah, it seems like the consensus is, I haven't done the reading on this, that the two-state solution is probably dead. And sooner or later, Israel's going to have to face up to the fact that that means they're running an apartheid state. It's funny. Like, I remember personally 20 years ago when people would say that Israel's an apartheid state. And I was 20 years ago. I was pretty racist against Arabs and was pretty enthusiastically Zionist. I was like, "Fuck you! You can't call Israel these the Holocaust, yada yada. How could you call them an apartheid state?" Now, I don't think anybody really disputes. Like, yeah, is building an apartheid state. That's what's going on there. The two-state solution is the thing that was like, no, 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 no. Yeah, sure, it's kind of an apartheid state now, but what we're doing is we're building towards this two-state solution. So the Palestinians will have their own state. It'll be fine. As it becomes clearer and clearer, and as Trump has made it very clear that the two-state solution is just not happening, then yeah, Israel's just an apartheid state. So that ain't great. More Freedom Foundation asks, Madi BKH asks, Iranian ballistic missile system question, isn't more deal with Iran make Iran weak like Libya, make it more possible to be attacked by USA? The thing about Iran is it's not a place we can attack. Like it's just like, yeah, we can bomb Tehran or something like that, but like we're not gonna fucking put ground troops into Iran. Like, even today, I don't know that we would do an Iraq-sized thing again today. The thing about Libya was it was just so fucking easy. It's like it is a huge country, but it's mostly desert and pipelines. And then all 6 million people live on the coast, with highways that go across the coast. It's extraordinarily easy place to attack and destroy, as we did. And that was 10 years ago. Like the complexity and difficulty, like I do believe a war between Iran and the United States is horrifyingly possible. Like that is something that could definitely happen. Where it would happen would be in Iraq and Syria, where we've already got troops on the ground. Like just the way that Iran is built, with mountain ranges and it's extraordinarily large. Its cities are far away from our assets. I think probably our aircraft carriers would be useless in a real shooting war with Iran. So no, I don't think. And also, Iran is already dramatically more democratically legitimate than any country in the Middle East other than Tunisia, probably. Morocco, maybe. One of the things we sort of leave out is like, yeah, Iran's got a parliament, and yeah, the supreme leader has powers that are excessive. But I think also very dependent on what the character and nature of the next supreme leader is. My understanding is that Ali Khamenei is pretty fucking old. As part of any reform process, it's basically, I mean, Iran's already got its democratic system that it would use to, sort of replace to sort of, the system that would replace it. Basically just means like either knocking the supreme leader out of the system or making the supreme leader into more of a conventional president or Supreme Court thing, while it's the Iranian prime minister gets more powers from the supreme leader. That's already there. Iran is already a much more legitimate democratic place. The thing about Gaddafi is his whole fucking legitimacy, his whole reason for being, his whole reason as a dictator was to fight the West. That was the only fucking thing that he was about. And even after in 2004, I believe it was, sort of, toadying up to the US and France, and welcoming in all their money, he was still a completely unaccountable strongman dictator without all of his legitimacy that he got from being a real anti-imperialist force. So yeah, like I think the Gaddafi and Iran parallel kind of fail on a number of counts, but I think that's probably a consideration. But Iran just is nowhere near as vulnerable as Libya is, for sure, and is also much more democratic and representative than any country other than Tunisia in the Middle East. So, yeah. Okay. Question. I didn't. Not a lot of super chats this time. Well, I'm grateful for every super chat, and I also was half an hour late, so I guess that's the way that's going to be. Sohab Yahya asks, "What do you think the U.S. will respond to Indonesia not hosting spy planes?" Oh, that's fascinating. I was not aware that Indonesia had refused to host U.S. spy planes. That sounds good. I don't think the U.S. can really do much about that, nor does it really matter that much, right? I mean, I assume Taiwan hosts our spy planes. I mean, who are we going to spy on from Indonesia? I mean, does Taiwan host our spy planes? I'm certain South Korea does. So yeah, I don't know. Though I suppose, yeah, we would want more of an Indonesian military sort of representation, because the Straits of Malacca are pretty important. So it sounds like Indonesia was making a very responsible decision by not letting the U.S. Base themselves there. I doubt the United States people in the CIA are smart enough to notice that. But yeah, I don't know. I don't think that the levers that we have to pull against Indonesia are that easy to pull. And I think that Joko Widodo, that's still the guy. I think he's probably does a pretty good job of currying favor with the U.S. Fogneber has a question with a super chat, which means I will instantly answer it. Resistance media contradicted its position en masse with regards to Amy Coney Barrett. Also, will we get Olympics next year? Wow, I don't know. I hate the Supreme Court. I think it is garbage. I think it is embarrassing. I think it is. The United States is nominally a sort of a democracy or a republic, yet every 2 years we go into some fucking succession crisis based on the fact that some septa or octogenarian died. That's bullshit. That's monarchy stuff. I hate the Supreme Court. So yeah, I don't really pay much attention to the succession crises. I think that the Supreme Court's very important. I ran a video recently about how Trump's judges are going to basically mean that there's no antitrust action against tech giants for the next couple decades, and that's a tragedy. But yeah, Amy Coney Barrett, like, man, like, so we're going to get another right-wing person on the Supreme Court. Elections have consequences, and I have consciously paid zero attention to the nomination controversies because they're meaningless, and the Republicans are going to vote her in regardless. And why would I put more mental investment into that? So yeah, not really. Don't have any. I don't know what controversy you're speaking about with the masks with regards to Amy Coney Barrett, and I probably don't care. Maybe it's important. Also, will we get the Olympics next year? That is important, and I'm guessing. Well, if it's the Summer Olympics are outside, right? It would, and I think, yeah, I think if I were in charge, I'd say we should do the Summer Olympics. But the idea of people going to stay in the stands in large numbers, that's probably not going to be the case, which is a real shame because, it's a fun sort of festival. But yeah, I think we could use some Olympics next year, frankly. I think that'd be good. Unless, where are they? I don't know. So I think aren't there some Winter Olympics coming up that might be boycotted because they're in China or something like that? To which I can only really say, who cares? It's the Winter Olympics. But yeah, the Summer Olympics, if they're meant to be next year, I think they should be next year. That's interesting. Local Extreme says, this is worrying. Fadel's question about a conspiracy beginning with Q got deleted by YouTube just now. Is YouTube censoring it? Man, I don't know. Q is some scary shit, and also social media companies deciding that they should censor certain things. Also kind of scary shit. My thoughts on that aren't particularly clear, and so I don't want to go drop them out. But obviously, I'm, especially as someone who is often putting forward somewhat dissident views about U.S. power and geopolitics, I'm obviously never a fan of Google and Facebook sort of censoring folks. With QAnon, I don't know, man. Like those guys are assholes, and it's really frightening how much power they have over the U.S. electorate. Trump still has 40% of 40% of the vote in most polling, and I think a lot of people, like a really disturbingly large number of that 40%, are still supporting them because of Q related, not because they believe in the whole Q conspiracy, but because they believe in sort of Q related ideas, like, oh, Democrats are all pedophiles, which is not true. Democrats and Republicans have equal numbers of pedophiles in their ranks, I'm sure, yeah, so I don't know. The Q thing is interesting, and it does seem like Facebook has weirdly consciously crafted itself to be more friendly towards old folks' weird ass conspiracies. So I don't know. It's a tremendously complex thing, but generally, I'm pretty anti censorship of any kind. And yeah, I don't know. But I do know I have a super chat from Brando Commando. Where did it go? There we go. Is American influence in decline? We're seeing Turkey, Russia, China, France be more aggressive in their long-term foreign policy goals. Will Turkey become a major power? And could France fill the US's void by becoming a new world police? So I think France will not be a new world police. I don't think France is going to make it much further out of West Africa. But actually, yeah, I think France will remain a big deal in West Africa and the Mediterranean. I think they may, in fact, still have a larger navy than Turkey. So that is kind of interesting and troubling, seeing two NATO allies sort of occasionally going head to head in the Mediterranean. That is not yet a real serious thing, as I think I indicated with my Greece-Turkey clown show video a couple months back that made Greek nationalists so angry. I think that sort of that round of crisis sort of ended when the U.S. put another big ship on Crete, a Greek island. So I still think that, like, I don't think it's quite serious to call Turkey, Russia, China, and France like being super more aggressive in their foreign policy goals. The idea of the China's being aggressive in their foreign policy goals is, to me, really ridiculous. Belt and Road, as I think I've talked about at length, is a big deal for Pakistan, and that's about it. It's kind of, I mean, there's real infrastructure being built, and that's great. But like this idea of debt traps and the whole South China Sea thing, like I've always seen like we decided to dump some concrete on some rocks in the ocean to be really quite pitiful when you consider it as a response to, oh, I don't know, the U.S. carving off Burma as a settled ally, arming Vietnam. Like, oh, well, we've got some rocks in the ocean. We put some stuff on. So yeah, I don't see that credible. I think what is indisputable is that the U.S.'s approach of destroying countries has indisputably led to some real damage and given real openings to Turkey, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. There's a lot of talk about, oh, well, the U.S. is falling away from leadership, and that's giving these people these openings. No, it's not actually the U.S. falling away from leadership. It's the United States destroying countries. Like Libya and Syria are the venues where Turkey is exerting itself and Russia is exerting itself. These are problems. These are proxy war. These are rich environments for proxy warring because the United States destroyed them. So I think the standard story that the U.S. is falling back and not being influential, it's actually an excess of U.S. influence and action that has led to this idea that there are more things, more countries acting as great powers and doing what great powers traditionally do. France, France is becoming more and more, is exerting itself more and more in West Africa. And that's because of the spillover from the U.S. destruction of Libya. So I think that is absolutely some truth to the idea that we're seeing specifically powers like Turkey, France, Russia get more aggressive and more more exerting themselves more on the world stage. But that's because the U.S. broke some places where they could exert themselves. So yeah, there was another super chat in here that I missed. Where did it go? Where did it go? Oh, there we go. Okay, Sebastian Moya asks, "What is the future of Islam and phobia in the future?" Oh man, that's so you can't actually say that in the chat. That's really unfortunate. What is the future of Islam and phobia in the future of American Muslims? Well, that's certainly. I cannot speak to the future of Islam. I am not. I've never read the Quran. I am not a religious scholar. My sense, though, what has been fairly successful part of my analysis is I sort of look at what is happening with Islam in a way that mirrors what happened with Christianity around the beginning of modernity in Europe. And there's this idea that like, oh, we had the Reformation and then everything got great. That's not true. The Reformation in Protestant Reformation in Europe was horrifically violent and destructive. And, what was it? A third of the people in Germany died in the 30 Years' War. My country, the United States, was founded by, in part founded by basically, Christian ISIS. There were a bunch of religious fundamentalist separatists that sort of started off New England. And really within 20 years, that had faded away and their religious utopias had already begun to fall apart. And that's, I think, my central insight with a lot of stuff related to extreme Islamic fundamentalism is that it's just sort of it's kind of in the process of a lot of that stuff is kind of running its course. I think in the UAE Israel deal video I did about a month back, I pointed out that like a lot of the reason why fundamentalism did so well was because the sort of more somewhat socialist, but more like sort of nationalist approach, nationalist modern westernizing approach of Nasser and I guess early Assad and others had just failed so spectacularly. So I guess folks are like, well, I guess we'll try extreme Islam now. And I think that's pretty obviously failed pretty miserably. And I think we'll see a different movement, in the coming decades. So, but yeah, I don't know exactly what that's going to look like. I think there's almost certainly going to be, I don't know. As far as Islamophobia in the United States, man, like it's already fading away. Of course, having said that, there'll be some horrific outrage coming up in the next year, or there'll be something that makes that statement sound silly. But I'm certain that if Trump loses, there will be some kind of violent actions, and that could be at a state house. That could be like the Oklahoma City when the federal government building in Oklahoma City was blown up. Could be like that, or it could be an attack on a mosque. Who knows? Or a synagogue. Probably more likely an attack on a synagogue, as there have been multiple. I believe multiple attacks on synagogues in the United States in the Trump era. So I don't want to say that like, oh, Islamophobia is over in the United States. But what's interesting is that the minority to hate in the United States, and there's always been a minority to hate in the United States. It's an unfortunate aspect of not the U.S., but really, everybody. But it's certainly been a factor in the United States. And I think for the past 20 years, is sort of the focus of our death dealing has been the Middle East. It's been, fear of Muslims has been inspired, paid for, and just grown up naturally as, we've been destroying Muslim countries. I am already seeing a very significant shift towards fear of China. And I think that's sort of where, there's a next group to hate. Especially it's interesting because the main club we have to beat China with is what they're doing to the Uyghurs, a Muslim minority within China. And I think that will sort of change things. I do think even the Pentagon in its, I believe, 2018 national security strategy has sort of acknowledged that the war on terror has just kind of run its course. So I am very hopeful for like what that means for sort of general Islamophobia. I think that people are going to find that it's I think there's actually going to be sort of professional Islamophobes who are going to be disturbed to find that nobody's really that interested in buying and, more importantly, funding the shit that they're spewing anymore. When our foreign policy, when our ability to sell weapons no longer relies as completely on the ability to getting the American people to hate Muslims, which I think it is less and less so now. When that's no longer the case, then yeah, I think people are going to be a lot less interested in funneling money to Jihad Watch and other Islamophobic entities. It's funny, like even now when somebody comes up with like really like extreme Islam hatred on the comments, it's almost like a little nostalgic for me now. I'm like, wow, like it's like 2015 up in here, like 2015 called. They want your hate talk back. They want their hate talk back because it's. I think it's something I can already see fading away, and I do spend a lot of maybe. I mean, I'm not hitting the detail. I'm not hitting Islamophobia and Islam as hard as I was 3 years ago, but I certainly still deal with North Africa, Turkey, a lot of Muslim countries on the channel, and I think that extreme hatred of Muslims that was very consciously built up by very wealthy sort of oil magnates and defense contractors in the United States is kind of floating away. I'm hopeful. That said, next year some fucking it only takes one deranged asshole shooting up a mosque. But I do think it's fading in the United States. So that's a very open-ended question. I hope I've done a decent job of answering it. Shit, there were two super chats. Where'd they go? That's one, and there was another one. Fadel. Oh, well, Fadel just gave me. Oh, wow, thanks, Fadel. But do you have a question? There's no question associated with that. All right, Mike No Guns. Thank you, Robert. Big fan of your videos. I can tell you firsthand how the sanctions are ruining Syria. If Assad falls, Syria will break up into several pieces. I think that's probably true. The sanctions that we maintain on Syria right now have always been ruinous. And the way that they function is the way that they functioned for a very long time was that because of our sanctions, anybody. Now, the United Nations was exempt. There were, humanitarian things that were exempt, but anybody who tried to work with Assad to rebuild Syria in any extent risked getting dinged by our sanctions. So while the U.S. would pour billions of dollars into humanitarian relief for Syria, those billions of dollars would exclusively go to rebel-held areas. So would essentially end up funding Al-Qaeda. And in 2020, we've made it dramatically worse with the Caesar sanctions, basically like fully unleashing Iran-style sanctions against Assad. What this means is that the Syrian economy is now probably in a worse state than it even was at the height of the Syrian Civil War. It's horrific there. We are murdering Syrian children with our sanctions. And it's just getting worse. And thank you, Mike Nogozones, for bringing up the sanctions. It is quite horrific what we've been doing there. I'm not 100% sure it's breaking up into several pieces, but I think that I think there's no question that the result would be chaos. I made a somewhat tongue-in-cheek, I'm not sure how tongue-in-cheek, video about is Assad Israel's only defense against Turkey. I think that was somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but I'm not 100% tongue-in-cheek. Like I think there's some real concerns there about what would happen if Syria devolved into chaos, and like how much more would Turkey feel obligated to take over. It's just grim. Obviously, if Assad fell, I'd probably Latakia and Latakia. That's where Tartus is, right? The province that is mostly occupied by the minority group that Assad is a member of. Yeah, that might split off. I mean, yeah, it would be a disaster. We really need to stop trying to kill Assad. That's I think the main thing. Questions. All right, we are coming. No, I guess I've got another 6 minutes before I hit the 2-hour mark. But once I hit the 2-hour mark, it's really like it's the super chats that will keep me talking. bribery, outright bribery. Averroes dude, that's a great name. Averroes dude. Do you expect Netanyahu to win his next election? I have not made a study of Israeli politics. I just haven't. I don't know. I do know that he's like the fucking Energizer Bunny. There's been, it seems like he's definitely going to fall, or corruption trials, or this, that, and the other thing, or da, da, da. So I just don't know. We're coming up, actually. I guess, gosh, probably in December. I'm going to run so not a competition. I'm going to run a poll for the patrons, for folks who choose to support this site on Patreon. It's Patreon. It's my crowdfunding thing. And for folks who chip in $2 a video, they will be able to vote on what my next big project is. Back in 2017, I did a long series of videos called Everybody's Lying About Islam, where I talked about the way that the US-Saudi relationship was the true root of terrorism and problems in the region and with sort of Islam more generally. And I had like a small book that I published on that. In 2019, I published a very large book called Avoiding the British Empire, talking about how the British Empire fell and the ways that the US was making the same mistakes. And I've got an ongoing series about those videos. So in December, I'm going to run a poll where we decide where all of the patrons decide what the next thing I'm going to cover is. There's going to be at least probably about three options. And one of those options will be Israel-Palestine. Like, I will devote the next 2 fucking years of my life to what those 10 million people in Israel and Palestine are up to. And I will read the books. I will read the histories. I will delve in. I will, make it a big deal if folks vote for that. But in order to vote for that, you've got to be signed up as a patron, which you can do on the homepage of my channel. There's a link to Patreon. You can sign up for that, and you will have the opportunity to make me finally cover Israel and Palestine. But as far as whether Netanyahu will win his next election, I don't know. Is Gilad on here? Has he got an opinion? I can't tell you. Can't tell you. Did I get all the super chats? That's Rose Dude. Got that one. Mike No Gun Zones. I got that one. Fidel gave me a big super chat, but didn't have a question. Oh, no. Sebastian Moy, I got that one. Brandon Commando. Okay, cool. So we are at the 2-hour mark. I will answer a few more questions because I was so goddamn late. And then I will mostly just answer super chat questions. And then I will do my closing spiel. I already did my closing spiel on the books. You should buy my books, Avoiding the British Empire. Everybody's Lying About Islam. You can find those on Amazon. Okay, question. Did COVID break Algeria's Iraq movement? That's an interesting question. I think, honestly, if so, and I don't know, maybe I do a little too much three-dimensional chess on this, talking about how Mas kind of dodged a bullet in Bolivia by not being in power for COVID. But Iraq, I think, is definitely, this is the protest movement that overtook Abdulaziz Bouteflika. Did I pronounce any of that right? Was in March of 2019, overthrew the guy who'd been there for 20 years and then continued to take to the streets and express their discontent with the pouvoir, with the system that had governed Algeria for so much time. And it does seem that the consensus is that that movement, after its great success of ousting Bouteflika, has sort of petered out. It's not going as much as it was. But I think that's actually not the worst thing, because Algeria is about to be it's not going to be Venezuela level, but it's a similar dynamic to Venezuela. With Venezuela, a lot of folks are like, oh, the U.S., savagely, evilly, destroyed that place. And I think with our sanctions, we now absolutely are doing savage and evil stuff to Venezuela. But with Venezuela is also the fact that the oil that they relied on selling to mostly the United States is too expensive to be viable right now. And while Algeria's gas is certainly still viable and still useful, they're not getting the prices they used to for that. So the context in which Algeria is working fiscally and economically is much more constrained than it used to be. And it would have really sucked for the Iraq to take over the country and then Be like, woohoo, we're in charge, we're democratic, and we have less money to work with than any Algerian government since the 1950s. Fuck. And that you could have easily seen the Hirak come to power, be democratic, it'd be a disaster, and then the old military elite come back. So it's actually kind of okay that the military elite now gets to try to figure out how to function with dramatically less money and do some of that suffering and reforming, and then the Hirak can come in later, hopefully. I don't know if that's a little too 12th dimensional chess, but yeah. So I think even before COVID, the consensus was that the Hirak had kind of petered out. But I don't think that's necessarily such a bad thing for the Hirak and for Algeria's potential for democracy going forward. Okay, More Freedom Foundation asks, what is the solution to African American on Afro American crime? Did Comey play a role in exacerbating it? Jesus, that's a big question, Logan. The solution to well, we know what the solution to African American versus African American crime is. I mean, I don't really like the concept of black on black crime. I've got a sort of irritated video talking about that from years back. But the way you solve crime is you fire all the police officers and then you rehire them and pay them if they work. So the problem in Chicago and Baltimore, those are sort of the worst cities. We used to have the problems we had in Chicago and Baltimore in a place called Camden, New Jersey. It's a place that I've been to. It is one of the most horrifically violent cities in. That's interesting. So Fadel does have a question, but yeah, I will get to that question, Fadel. Camden, New Jersey was one of the most violent cities in the country, but it's also a small city. And what they were able to do there was fire all of the police who had obviously done a horrific job keeping the place safe. And then they rehired the ones that were actually good. And actually, I think ended up hiring more police on balance. But what was key was that if in a city like Chicago, in a city like Baltimore, what you've got is a sick police force. You've got yes, you've got incredible challenges, poverty, yada, yada, yada. But fundamentally, if a city is that fucked up and that violent, you've got a police force that has no idea how to do its job and has no interest in doing its job. That's what we had in Camden, New Jersey. Somebody came in, they fired everybody, rehired everybody, and sorry, not rehired everybody, but rehired the folks who were willing to work, crushed the union, and Camden is now dramatically more peaceful. And weirdly, you have the police force leading the Black Lives Matter protests in Camden, New Jersey. It's tremendously successful. We know exactly how to solve the problems in Chicago and Baltimore, and that is, fire your police force and start over. Because you do need a police force, but the problem with Chicago is the police force they have now. So yeah, that is my. Not sure I'd really recommend doing that right now. We've got some other issues to solve with COVID and whatnot. The extent to which this sort of crime issue in the United States is this sort of amorphous thing that's completely divorced from what's happening. It's like, yes, crime actually now, for the first time in a legitimate way since the 90s, is skyrocketing in the United States because millions of people have lost their jobs. Of course. So yeah, right now is probably not the right time to take major cities like Chicago, fire the police forces, and figure out how to start over. There are some other things we need to focus on, like general COVID response. But okay, so Fadel, your question was, with white nationalism rising through Western and Eastern Europe and North America, could it lead to a more chauvinist foreign policy? That's a great question. A more white pride foreign policy? I mean, the thing is, though, what would a white pride foreign policy look like? Outside support for Israel? Yeah, I mean, trading advantages for white countries. These are all things we already have. So, to the extent that the thing about a nationalist foreign policy in Europe is it's mostly just going after other white people. So it's kind of hard to see how that becomes the things that I'm most worried about in Europe are sort of Northern Ireland versus the United Kingdom, Hungary versus Romanians or Slovakians or really anybody else on the periphery. So white on white crime is sort of what I'm worried about with surging nationalism in Eastern Europe. Would that mean that maybe um, the thing about white nationalism as far and foreign adventuring is that I don't think there's much. I think the way it works now with sort of white supremacists, they sort of acknowledge that foreign adventuring by their militaries kind of leads to more refugees and more non-white people coming into their countries. So I think where white nationalism and growing nationalism in Europe and the United States gets really troubling and terrifying is what it means for domestic policies. Like we've already seen Stephen Miller, Jeff Sessions, and Donald Trump dramatically change the immigration policies of the United States. So yeah, that's scary. But as far as foreign policy, I'm not yet. I'm sure that give it 5-10 years, if like a white nationalist or just nationalist regime took power in the United States or Europe, they would figure out how to cover up for their failings by invading someone the way every U.S. government always does. So yeah, but as of now, I don't see the way that the white nationalism instantly jumps into like setting up new African empires or something. I don't see that. I mean, I'm sure it can evolve in like nasty ways, but like it's hard to envision a more white supremacist foreign policy than we currently have. You know, uh, so, but that's interesting to think about for sure. All right, so it has been 2 hours and 5 minutes. Oh, there's another super chat. Sorry, how did I miss that? Michael Edlington says, "Will Syrian refugees be repatriated?" No. Why? Why would we do that? That's awful. I think that the first step towards getting Syrian refugees to go home in some numbers would be to allow Assad to rebuild Syria. That's a really key thing, and also to make rebuilding funds contingent on the extent to which he is welcoming to Sunni populations who have left. That's something I proposed 3 years ago. But that's not something that the US government is interested in doing. I will say that there is zero repatriation of refugees possible before there is some kind of rebuilding allowed to happen in Syria. So if you're somebody who desperately wants the Syrians to leave, then you want your governments to start forcing the rest of the world to allow Assad to win the war. He has won the war. And now it's time to rebuild Syria. But the US is refusing to let that happen. So, like, what's fascinating is sort of the degree to which Merkel's supposedly in 2015, it was common knowledge that Merkel had screwed herself politically and fucked over Germany by letting in these million, poor terrorists or whatever. 5 years later, Merkel is still in power, and more people have been like, "Shit, she really hit the jackpot." Like, because demographically, Europe is fucked. Every country in Europe has real serious problems that they're hitting now. I don't want to sound too much like Peter Zeihan, but it's true that they're hitting now, where they're Democrat. Like this year, baby boomers are beginning to retire in massive numbers. Their workforces are disappearing, except for Germany and Sweden that took in hundreds of thousands or millions of young workers. So yeah, Merkel's looking like kind of a genius. I think that even once we finally got peace in Syria, I think that absolutely many Syrians will go home, but many will not. Because they are making money, and it'll end up being as good for Syria having this massive sort of European diaspora as it has been for Turkey. And it has been very good for Turkey. So yeah, I don't think Syrian refugees are going to be repatriated in large numbers. Well, certainly from Lebanon, fuck yeah, and from Turkey probably to a degree, because there's a lot of. I mean, Europe didn't really take many refugees compared to Lebanon or Turkey. So yeah, some are definitely going to go home from there just because there's so many. All right. Questions. Um, do we have questions? We've got 87 folks left here. It's been 2 hours and 15 minutes. So if there aren't any more super chats, I'm going to just sort of start doing my closing spiel. Let's see. Oh, that's interesting. It's an interesting debate. Can we keep up with the growth mindset eternally? Of course not. We need to look beyond population and economic growth as markers for individual and societal well-being. Actually, Michael Hunt, I disagree with that. I am a big fan of the eternal growth thesis. I think we can totally do it. Obviously, to do that, we need to go through extraordinary technological development with an eye towards preserving our sort of environmental resources and figuring out how to get off planet in a consistent way. But anyway, that's a great question. But without super chats, I'm going to stop. My name is Robert Morris. This is the More Freedom Foundation. Every Tuesday, I upload a video. This month, I've been managing to do 2 a week. I think I should also manage that this week as well. But I've got now almost 500 videos up. I think that if you're interested in a given country, I may have said something about it at some point, and I try to keep my content kind of evergreen. I do respond to sort of events and stuff, but with the exception of what I've said about Iraq, I think there is stuff going back to 2014, 2015 that's actually sort of worthwhile and still worth watching. So I'd encourage you to do that. I got a super chat from Fadel. What? Did they delete your question again? Hopefully he'll show up with a question. Super chat won't ask questions. Won't let him ask questions. Okay, so Fadel, what do you? Oh, it's just a super chat to keep me going. I'll keep going. Anyway, name's Robert Morris, More Freedom Foundation. We put the videos up every Tuesday. I can be found on Twitter at RoboLaw, where I have extended conversations with a lot of the folks who are in this super chat. At RoboLaw. I've weirdly been doing a lot on Instagram recently at the Golden Age. Just sort of I did a whole sort of super chat on Bolivia, not super chat. I did a whole series of stories on Bolivia. I think that Instagram is really kind of interesting. Instagram and TikTok, I think on Twitter, I am sort of locked in with a lot of folks, like everybody who's watching right now, who are sort of brain broken and love talking about politics and geopolitics and whatnot. But I feel like if I'm serious about getting a saner message about foreign policy out, I actually need to try to reach out a little further. And that's why I have that embarrassing TikTok that I've put together. It's pretty embarrassing. I think on Instagram, I'm trying to do a better job of that as well. You can donate at generally more than sure what you're referring to. Really, Saudi Arabia really hates Qatar. For what's interesting is Qatar is a nominally Wahhabi country, like Saudi Arabia, but Qatar has decided that the way to use its extreme oil wealth is to set up a little television channel called Al Jazeera. And Al Jazeera was a bit of a hate object in the United States around the Iraq War and 9/11 because it reported, honestly, any U.S. news source about the destruction of Iraq. Qatar is run by a Wahhabi royal family, but Qatar weirdly takes. Now, my understanding is not the Arabic language version, and it's the Arabic language version is apparently very different, but the English language version provides a fairly critical opinion on most Arab governments. And I think the Arabic version does as well, except it's also more anti-Semitic. So that's one reason why Saudi Arabia really hates Qatar. And Qatar just sort of decided that, you know what, I'm gonna have a different foreign policy from Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And Saudi Arabia and the UAE really don't appreciate that. So there was a huge crisis in 2016. Saudi Arabia, I think, was threatening invasion. And the U.S. was like, hey, we've got a base in Qatar, you dumbasses. And nothing sort of happened from that. Also, Turkey also did some basing in Qatar. So Turkey is a much more serious military state than Saudi Arabia, like by far. So yeah, I don't think Qatar is getting invaded. I'm not sure what the Saudi banning is you're talking about, Everose dude. Maybe you can chime in again. Um, oh, it's lagging. What? That's unfortunate. Flash Gordon asks, More Freedom Foundation, would you go on the Modern Day Debate channel, or have you done so before? I mean, I don't know. Sure, I'd need to do more collaborations. That's for sure. I don't know what the Modern Day Debate channel is though. How many years will it take for the Assad regime to end? Man, no idea. Let's see. So if there are no more super chats, I think I've done my spieling. And I am super grateful to all of you who are here. There's still 60. Oh, here we go. Question from Fadel with a new super chat. Does the U.S. need to drop its "we're European descendants" to rebuild its relationship with sub-Saharan Africa? Well, we are European descendants, and we are African descendants, and we're America. We are the world. I don't know that the U.S. really has emphasized for the past 60 years its European heritage. I think it's a conscious Cold War strategy. We emphasized how our ideals were against the idea of just being a white ethno-state and were much more broadly applicable. In 1964, in the 1920s, the United States very much set up an immigration policy that was racist, that excluded Asians, that excluded everybody, even Eastern Europeans and Southern Europeans. And then in the 60s, as part of the Cold War, we lifted that. I mean, in 1964, the U.S. was still, it was a white and a black country. That is no longer the case, I think, to our great profit. I think the U.S. is extraordinarily diverse compared to the way it was just 40 years ago, or I guess 60 years ago at this point. And I think that continues to grow. I think that there are, Fadl, I think there are elements like Donald fucking Trump and other folks that want to bring back a more European race conscious aspect to our public messaging. Sorry, I guess I'm contradicting myself. So the way that our policy works is we've been extraordinarily friendly to Europe, and for sure. But the way that our messaging works is, I think, is already very consciously distanced from sort of racial, ethnic, white supremacy in a way that, honestly, I don't think any European countries really is capable of as we are. I think that's one of the most exciting things about the United States. Is that, and especially as it's amazing just how new the United States, in a lot of ways, the United States is older than you think. And I've got videos on that, but in terms of like the populating and the way that the United States is sort of always new in a lot of ways. Like, I mean, most of the people who live in the United States, their families didn't get here until like 100 years ago or less. Like, that's pretty cool. I don't know. Or 150 years ago or less. Like, and I think that's kind of fascinating. That's something that I think we really benefit from continuing to renew. I think the sort of white ethnic identity was actually a way to get a bunch of people who were extraordinarily diverse and sort of hated each other in a lot of ways to sort of get along. And what we're struggling with right now is like, okay, how do we move beyond like the white, identity in a cultural sense? And I think we'll figure it out, frankly. Trump obviously is, not helpful. Or actually, he might have been in some ways. We'll see. Anyway, I'm pretty optimistic about that sort of stuff. Okay, last chance for super chats. James Cook asks, why is it normal to have only one channel supporting Trump and all the other supporting Biden? Because Trump is an asshole. I mean, let's be honest. But what's interesting is it was actually the Fox News that introduced the era of biased, completely biased journalism. And MSNBC only sort of followed in the Bush years. And CNN really only followed in the past couple of years. So, Fox News started it, basically. Okay. Flash Gordon says, prepare for Trump to win again. Last time I won 2,000 pounds. If you bet on the number of seats markets, you can cover all options and tie and make more profit. Wow. I am not betting on this election, but I'm pretty sure Biden's going to win. Could be wrong. I was not pretty sure that Clinton was going to win. I was always pretty suspicious of the idea that Hillary Clinton would be president. I am not suspicious of the idea that Biden would be president. But holy shit, we'll know by the next time we do a big live chat. You all can laugh at me if Trump is still president. Anyway, you guys are awesome. You guys are the reason this channel exists. Ooh, look, Adolf Hitler. What do you think of Jews? I'm just gonna. Wait. Adolf Hitler. What do you think of Jews? Remove. There we go. Right. Cool. That was easy. And can I just block him? Can I just block him? Anyway. You guys are great. You're the reason this channel exists and is here. And I'm tremendously grateful. Yeah, hit me up on Twitter. Thank you so much for viewing, being a part of this. You're the reason this channel exists. We also do a patrons only live chat every month. So if you want to do more of this sort of thing, you can sign up for that. Those are fun, and those basically I answer every question and read every comment because so far there aren't that many people there. It's like 10, 15 people instead of 100 odd as we had at some points today. Anyway, thank you so much. I am going to end the stream. Very grateful. Thank you.